Good evening, everybody that's watching. Welcome to episode 30 of Mark's Mouthpiece. My guest tonight is Mark Hughes, the principal trumpet of the Houston Symphony Orchestra. And before we get started, I'd like to thank my sponsors, Euclid IQ, which is today's leader in audio and video compression, as well as Dylan Music. You can visit Euclid IQ at euclidiq.com and Dylan Music at dylanmusic.com. And if you go to Dylan to shop for any of your musical needs, just give them the code Doolin5 and you'll get a 5% discount. So Mark Hughes, welcome. Thanks for doing this tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So Mark, you and I have known each other now for quite a while, and so it's always a pleasure to catch up. But I always feel like there's more things I need to ask you. So I thought, why not? Let's do it.
Thank you. Yeah.
So can you talk a little bit about, this is stuff we haven't talked about too much. When did you start playing? What age were you?
I started when I was in 5th grade. And at that time, growing up in the Atlanta area, many of the school systems, they were starting, we didn't have middle school. We had elementary, junior high, and high school. And because of that, in elementary school, we would start band at 5th grade and have 2 years. I wanted to start in 4th grade, but they would not let me start. My brother was a trumpeter, and my older brother. And being, sibling rivalry the way it is, I wanted to play as soon as possible. But when I finally did get to start in 5th grade, I had a trumpeter. The way Clayton County schools worked, the high school directors and the junior high directors took their afternoons each day and went and visited the elementary schools. So the schools are set up in a very smart way, because those teachers, if they didn't do a good job starting kids, they got to inherit their mistakes. So it really was a motivating factor for them to set themselves up well. And everybody wants a good first trumpet player, and everybody wants a good first clarinet player in their bands, and to constantly have that fed. And so that was a very fortunate kind of time for me. So I did start in 5th grade.
Yeah. And Joe Wathall was your first trumpet teacher out of the Atlanta Symphony. Is that right?
Yeah, that sort of is true. My very first trumpet teacher is still a Facebook friend of mine, Ron Biffle. And Ronnie Biffle was also a band director in the area, and I started studying privately with him when I was in 7th grade. And I went through the Arbin book for the first time, really kind of in junior high school with Ronnie. And by the 8th grade year, I clearly remember when Mr. Biffle said to me, "Mark, I've taught you everything that I can teach you. You play better than I do. We need to find you a better teacher." And, that sounded like a really nice, sweet, humble man, which he is, a terrific teacher. And I just sort of ignored that and didn't even bother to tell my parents, we just kept going. And in 9th grade, we had to sit down chat again in a lesson. And he said, "Mark, we've got to get you you need to find a better teacher. I'm learning as much from you." And what we basically did is sight read for 30 minutes every week.
Yeah.
And finally, he came to me with Joe Walthall's name. And we called Joe Walthall. And as it turns out, he would teach 1 day a week on the south side of Atlanta at a Tina's music store. And I started studying with him at the beginning of my 10th grade high school year. And Joe, was, of course, that first professional player I'd ever heard. And Joe was sort of in the prime. I mean, he was doing so much session work. Atlanta used to be a real hotbed for session work. He could make as much money outside of the orchestra doing sessions as he did make in the orchestra. I mean, he was very busy. And he could do things on the horn that, I wanted to do when I grew up, kind of thing. And really started planting that seed in me that, you could actually play for a living. And I also was just blown away by his powerful sound that he had. And, and to this day, I still have, especially when I play a pop show, there's a lot of Joe Walthall in me. And if people like that, well, now you know where I get it. And if they don't like it, they know where I got it. I just have a lot of Joe Walthall in me, and I frequently think of him because he's a good friend. We sat next to each other in the Atlanta Symphony, for many years, and we had a lot in common. And he was like my musical dad in a lot of ways, taught me a lot of things. And to this day, when something goes really well, I will think during a performance, man, I wish Joe could have heard that. I wish Joe could have heard that, that kind of thing. And Joe means a lot to me and my musical makeup of who I am. It's if you go back, Mark, I know you're living in Atlanta now, and if you ever can get to the archives at Georgia State University, when he was a student at Georgia State, they used to do a brass symposium every year, and they made a record of new works. They only performed brand new works that were written for the symposium. And you can hear him play, and your jaw is going to hit the ground, because you're going to go, why wasn't this guy playing in a major orchestra? It wasn't a major orchestra, but one of the big five or something, playing principal somewhere. He was scary good, and that was when he was a kid.
What position was he in the ASO? Was he playing second?
Well, in the ASO, he was principal. Is a weird sort of thing when he was principal second and assistant principal. And that was back when they had a 3-man section. And so all of the second players were also the assistant principals. So, which is sort of strange, because a true, really good second player usually isn't going to be a real good assistant or associate. Yeah. But he was able to play, he just played all the time. He was a horse. And just did a great job.
Yeah. It was so who was principal in New York? Was John Head principal when you were growing up in the ASO?
John Head was principal from, I think, early 60s up until the time of when Jim Thompson won the principal job in 1990. And in 1990, John was well, I hate to say demoted, but I think he chose to move down to associate principal, and he played that job from 1990 to 1994. And at that time, John had retired, and when he did, that opened the associate job, and that's the job I won in the summer of 1994.
Right. And we'll come back to that in a minute. I want to see, what kind of things did Joe have you working on as a student?
Joe, he didn't have the, pedagogy that I got exposed to at Northwestern. He had studied mostly at Georgia State with the one brass teacher, Bill Hill, who was a trombonist by instrument, but he taught all of the brass instruments there at the school. And so it was a real fundamental kind of teaching, going through the Arvin book mostly. Yeah. And so Joe would always revert back to anything, we would go to the Arvin book, pull out the Arvin book, page 183, let's use this word, blah, 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 or whatever. And we had a few other books. I mean, I used the Voxman Selected Studies book. We had a Conconi book. We had a few things. But most of that, I think Joe had gotten from taking a few lessons after he was in the Atlanta Symphony. He would go up and study some with Chikowitz, and had a little bit of that exposure that he used in his teaching. But we didn't do a lot. Like, I didn't do Clark studies with Joe. I was doing scales, hard solos. I do remember Joe taking me up to Northwestern when I was a junior in high school, and I had worked up the Tomasi concerto, and I'd worked up the Telemann in D major. It seems like I had something else, but I can't remember it right now. But I mean, that's pretty hefty lifting for someone that's, barely 16 years old.
Yeah,
and
state solos for those years?
Pardon?
They weren't those the Georgia All-State solos for that?
No, they weren't. and so Joe, I assume Joe knew what he had and was just pushing me, keeping things in front of my nose that would keep me working and working on multiple tongue. And I'll tell you, interestingly enough, to me, Joe was who taught me all the multiple tonguing that, and I will tell you, that's when I got to Northwestern, we never worked on multiple tonguing. He always said, Mark, you do that really well. So, Joe is who really refined all of that kind of teaching and perfecting it in me, so I owe him a lot.
If he taught you multiple tonguing, what were the syllables he was trying to get you to use? Because people talk about the differences.
Wah and blay, wobblay, wobblay, wobblay. I'm joking. That's something that Bob Wolf and I talk about at work all the time. I'm using the wobblay tongue. No, Joe would use T and K and sometimes D and G as the syllables, and he had this actually sounds so logical when I mention it. It's not going to seem at all weird, but we worked on triple tonguing and not so much on double tonguing. And he said, this was his statement. He said, have you ever noticed that triple tonguing comes first in the Arvin book? Which it does.
It does, yeah.
And he says, well, look, if you learn to triple tongue, double tongue's a piece of cake. And that's all true. And so we would start working on triple tongue, and he had a real methodical way of going through it. 5 steps. You would start by single tonguing the etude slowly, like the very first Arvin, ta 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 ta, and then you would go back and K tongue it. Ka 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 ka. You've probably done that with every student, ever, right? And then we would go back and with a metronome, very carefully, we would single tongue the first 2 T's and put an 8th rest in where the K goes. Ta ta rest ta ta rest ta 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 rest ta 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 ta. Because the big problem that every one of my students ever has is that those 2 T's, if they're too far apart, are too close together, the triple tongue doesn't hum. Right. You'll get and you'll hear great players, as fine as they exist, and when they triple tongue, it will be either compressed or not even.
Right.
And you just got to slow it down and make sure those 2 T's are right in the right spot. And then the next time through, you add the K with the K being accented. Ta ta ka ta ta ka ta, and then the last time you play it straight. Ta ta ka 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 ta ka ta, and then it becomes, like the old Mazda rotary engine commercials. I'm dating myself completely because I bet you don't know those commercials.
I don't even know those commercials.
the Mazda, when Mazda first hit the United States, they had a car that had a rotary engine, and a rotary engine basically was a camshaft that was shaped like a triangle in a round tube, had a spark plug in 3 areas, equal distant around the circle, causing that equilateral triangle to spin, and that was the crankshaft. And so if they're evenly spaced apart, and the old commercial would say, and the Mazda goes hum. Well, that is my picture for triple tongue. If I am really triple tonguing right, it just sort of flows. It just sort of just runs like a wheel right down the road very smoothly. But if that middle T gets a little bit too soon or a little too late, it'll lope. And and which is the problem we hear, 95, 98% of the time.
It might have been the problem I heard about 3 hours ago.
I mean, it's just one of those things. And I have always found, for me, that practicing multiple tongue is very therapeutic for my airflow.
Right.
So I use multiple tonguing a lot of times if I'm having any kind of air issue. I will pull out, Arvin triple tongue pages and just play through those, and then I'm fixed pretty quickly thereafter.
Wow. And what were you listening to when you were growing up in high school?
That's a really good question. Uh, you know, there's a part of me that wants to try to say to people, this is what you need to listen to, and but being bluntly honest, I was a trumpet geek. I loved listening to trumpet music, and my first teacher, Ronnie Biffle, had given me a stack of LPs, probably about 15 or 20 LPs of a lot of Maurice Andre
Mhm.
and some like Armando Gatala and trying to remember Helmut Volbisch and some Adolf Scherbaum. And then there was a Cleveland recording in there. I remember I listened to a lot of the Golden Cockerel and getting to hear Bernie play before I knew anything. And hearing that sparkling first trumpet playing in Cleveland Orchestra. And then that was in junior high. And then in high school, I sort of went into this Doc Severinsen phase. And I listened to Doc all the time.
Yeah.
I mean, I went to bed with headphones on. I had a turntable on my dresser right next to my bed. And I would put a stack, it was those old cheap turntables, you could stack up LPs. And I would put 2 or 3 Doc Severinsen albums on there. My favorite being the Rhapsody for Now album.
Yeah.
And I would listen to that. A lot of people think they're cheesy ballads, but I have always been a fan of Doc Severinsen and his lyricism and the way he plays. He is singing. And if you want to get into Arnold Jacobs and singing, man, Doc Severinsen sang his butt off when he played. It still does.
Yeah.
I shouldn't say played, when he plays.
Right.
And I still love to listen to some of those old, ballads, Summer of 42. Man, and he's playing on a mouthpiece, probably, that's kind of like a dime with a hole drilled in it. And he's getting this big fat low G. And you're thinking, like, how's he doing that? Well, there's Arnold Jacobs in practice right there. You hear it and you do what you need to do physically. And what Doc Severinsen is doing may be different than what I do or you do. But if we're singing that song loud enough in our head, our bodies will figure out what it takes to do it. And so that, honestly, I mean, true confessions, I
Yeah.
was listening to Doc Severinsen all the time, and not so much to orchestra playing. At that time, my dream job was going to be playing lead in a big band.
Yeah.
And that's really what I wanted to do.
Well, I mean, great trumpet playing is great trumpet playing, right? I mean, you know,
I agree.
yeah, and
You
there,
know,
and I mean, later on, there was so much great trumpet playing with, you would hear Jerry Hay and Gary Grant, and all those guys on pop music.
oh,
You know,
yeah.
and so, yeah, and those records, the Doc records you're talking about, are timeless. There's nothing.
Yeah, well, one thing that I do see here, and I'm sure you see it too, a lot of times today, people you're sort of pigeonholed into listening. And if you just listen to orchestral music, yeah, that's great. And you need to do that. But I have never had a job where I didn't need to understand a complete worldview of style.
Mhm.
And maybe that's why I have the job I have too. I mean, I sort of dictate style to my section and to my brass section. And it's probably, one of those things. And I remember my high school director telling me I always had a little like a sixth sense of being able to look at music and perceive the style immediately and have a quickness to that. And that I don't know if that's true or not. I do know that I love all kinds of music. And if you knew how crazy varied my listening was, it's incredible. And you name any kind of music, and I bet you money, I can talk with you about it, and I love it because there's good and bad of everything. And if you find the good in it, you're going to find some piece of classical music that some composer agrees with that and has incorporated it. And they need somebody that can identify with that to really make that music come alive. And so if all of you've listened to his Mahler symphonies in your formative years, and I think that's great, that's wonderful, but there's plenty of time to learn German style. I mean, don't forget about everything else. Don't forget about listening to Frank Sinatra croon a beautiful phrase, because I'm sure you agree with me. When we listen to musicians today, so many times it's like there's no phrasing. They don't understand. Herschel used to always say, like, put words to that.
Yeah.
Whatever maybe it's nonsense syllables, but it's better if it is a sentence, and it will have a natural flow if that sentence becomes a lyric. So anyway, I sort of got off the beaten path there a little bit, but that's sort of my listening was all over the place. I mean, I listened to everything from hard acid rock to country to Western music to you name it. It's pretty crazy.
Well, I know you're really excited about the Taylor Swift album drop the other week.
Touche. Now, I'll have to say, I don't listen to Taylor Swift all that often, but similar styles.
Yeah, my daughter loves it, but
I did say it had to be good.
Actually, a good friend of mine just produced her newest record, so I'm really happy for him. But yeah,
the stuff coming out of Nashville is shockingly good, and has been now for what, 30, 35 years. The giggers in that town are unreal. When you look at all the pickers, you go to, if you're ever up there and a musician, look at the Union Book, and get to the guitar page. Yeah. And when you have 300 or 400 guitarists, there's something about the quality does rise to the top, and they have some amazing backup musicians.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, what drew you to Northwestern? Was it the study when Mothall took you up to see Chikowitz? And
this is really shocking to me, because now, after having children grow up and all of the deals of having them apply to so many different schools and all that stuff. But when I was in high school, we were just talking about this at dinner. Like when we took an SAT test, it was like no big deal. We just took an SAT. And you didn't take it more than once. You just took it once. And it was just sort of what it was. And we weren't all that competitive. I only auditioned and applied to one school. I applied to Northwestern, and I did early notification. And my theory was, if I didn't get in there, then I could always go to, Berry College or, Stetson or some of these at the time, other sort of. And I remember Joe Walthall getting just so upset at me when he found out I'd only applied to one school. But I only applied to Northwestern, and because that was the place to go. Yeah. At that time, and you could argue that today, it's still like Juilliard for classical trumpet playing. Yeah. And it was the place to go. And so me being the dumb little kid, from Jonesboro, on the south side of town, I just thought that everything would work out. And fortunately it did. Yeah. And I was able to go. So the first Mahler symphony I ever heard was Mahler 5, hearing Bud Herseth play it. I didn't know how to pronounce it. I actually said Mailer, because the Atlanta Braves had a pitcher by the name of Mailer, spelt the same way. And I thought it was Mailer's 5th symphony, and I didn't know any better.
I think in that era of the Braves, that was probably Mailer's 5th earned run of the game that he had given up. I remember that baseball card, right? So what were the first lessons like with Mr. Chikowitz coming?
He was amazing, and so gentle, and some of it is how we perceive a teacher and the respect. I fully knew that he was the man, and you feel very special just to be able to study with someone like that. But to go into the studio with him, and he was very gentle, very encouraging. Um, you know, you always look forward to every lesson. I mean, lessons were the highlight of your week,
Hmm.
and I mean, it was just one of the highlights of my life, getting to see how he would do things. And then we would get together. The studio, he insisted on it being very close knit.
Hmm.
Early on, we had a master class like the first week I was in school or second week. And he got the whole studio together. And the studio was large, it's 36 players that we all studied with him. And he basically told us if we could not be supportive of one another and encouraging and get along, that he would find us another place to go to school. He made it very, I mean, very sternly put. And we did. We got along extremely well. We're very encouraging. We shared horns. We played for each other. And if you think that that sounds like a fairy tale, then I guess we were living in a fairy tale. But that is literally the way it was. It was so wholesome and so supportive. And I think that's why there's so much success in those years when Chikowitz was really pumping out player after player every year. So he nurtured us and was very supportive. Um, he used the same materials with pretty much everybody. I mean, depending on your year and where you were in the developmental stream, but he would use it, but he would use it differently. You've heard the stories of Schlossberg, and he would maybe have one person play this same etude that he would write piano, and somebody else he would do it forte, and somebody else he'd have them crescendo on every note, and somebody else he'd have them do one long big diminuendo, and that's the way Chikowitz was. He used Clark studies, but he would adapt them to whatever your needs were. And Mark, if you and I were studying, in hour blocks back and forth between the two of us, he might use the same exact etudes between the two of us and have us do them completely differently.
Yeah.
I mean, and that was what Chikowitz was like. You always felt like you could trust someone because he had this master plan in his mind of what you needed to get you to over the finish line.
Yeah.
So I sort of feel like I'm being Pollyanna or being gullible, but that's sort of the way we were. We were kind of just trusting of him, and we just did what he said.
Yeah.
And we knew eventually we would get to harder things, but we were all starting out the beginning of the Arvin book with the long tone studies. Every menu that we got a weekly menu.
Yeah.
And they always said at the top, mouthpiece tones, long tone studies, Clark studies, and then Arvin. And he'd have several Arvin things. And then we'd start having other etudes that he would add to that, the Biscay book or whatever.
Right. Now, when you were talking long tone studies, are we talking about the famous pattern? Is that what you mean? That was what.
Yeah. Ba da da dee da 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 dee da 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 dee. Yeah, those.
Those. Yeah, I'm familiar. And, so, what kind of things in Arvin was he? Well, actually, one of the questions I had, maybe before I get too specific with that, I think a lot of the perception with Mr. Chikowitz is all about the flow studies and the legato and that part of the playing. But speaking of which, Michael Chikowitz is calling me. He should know I'm doing this. There is the articulation, right? Because his articulation was
Yes.
fantastic. And I think a lot of times that's ignored when we're talking about him. Could you talk about that a little bit, and especially that phrase "illusion of staccato"?
Oh, absolutely. He used to do a master class just called "The Illusion of Staccato." The one thing when you listen to the Chicago Symphony, unless you're deaf, you got to be aware of how much articulation they also use. And the way this is the world according to Mark Hughes here, so don't put this in the encyclopedia. I could be wrong, but I don't believe I am. Herseth, who was really the founding block of, I mean, there was great trumpet playing going on there all the way back in the days of Llewellyn, 50 years before Herseth. But Herseth was by far the best trumpeter that had come and sat in that seat when he was there. And if you think about Herseth's genealogy, he studied with Mager, a Frenchman. And if you really listen to Herseth, he doesn't have a German articulation. He has a French articulation with a German sound. Right. And if you put those together, voila, you've got America. That's the American trumpet player. French articulation, a lot of front end. You listen to the Cleveland Orchestra, same thing. Might be a slightly different tonal sound, but the articulations have a lot of bite on the front end of those. And you start listening to the Boston Symphony, same thing. That is orchestral playing, is that nice, firm button articulation. Well, I automatically did that. And that, you remember early on I said when I was in junior high school, Ronnie Biffle gave me a stack of Maurice Andre records. Mm-hmm. Probably the best thing he ever did was give me those Maurice Andre records and ask me from week to week or whatever, what did I listen and what pieces I liked, which encouraged me to listen to those albums. Right. And listen to that front end. That Maurice Andre button, that French button, was Herseth, and that's Chikowitz. Now, Chikowitz did not talk about it, but when he picked up his horn and he played, that's what we heard. Right. And we do a lot of duplication to what we hearing that firm articulation. But he would talk about it. Most people can get a good tongue, but if you don't have the air flowing freely with the tongue, that's where you get into trouble. Right. Well, the Chicago Symphony, those guys had it. They were always a big fat sound. Well, how do you get that big fat sound if you tongue and you stop your air in between each note? You kill your sound. And so the whole concept of this illusion of staccato was that you played your 16th notes without separating the air, and you tongued harder. And if you tongue harder, that creates some of the natural separation in the notes, but the air doesn't get any kind of compression or tension on the air. And when we do that, you hear how it's affecting my voice. Well, it affects our tone the same way. Yeah. So Chikowitz would use the Arbin book. Mm-hmm. And see how I'm working back around here and answering your question?
Yes, that's exactly what I was hoping you would do.
So what he would do is he would take those studies, like anything like the gruppettos or the and then the normal trumpet tendency is to really shorten those notes. You get tighter and tighter. And the second note under the slur, where you're slurring two notes together, da, 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 we frequently will make that note clipped. And if you do that, you're engaging your gut again in the negative. And every time you do one of those, you're like, if you have a handbrake, emergency brake on your car, that's in a bunch of clicks, you're going up a click every time you do it. And there's more and more tension. You're killing your sound, you're killing your efficiency, and notes get to where they don't speak. And then the famous Chikowitz line would be, Mark, put the horn down. And we would go through and we would blow the air pattern. Now let's go back and put that in the horn. Da, 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 da. And when it feels right, because it feels very free and natural and easy. Right. And it sounds that way. And it is a trust issue as well. You've got to learn to trust and then record yourself and know that what you're doing actually does sound better than what you were doing when you were killing your sound. And to this day, that is a physical struggle that I have to remind my body how to do that correctly. But that illusion of staccato concept is how the Chicago Symphony and all of those glorious years that you listen to, they kept a nice big fat sound even on short notes.
Now, is part of the illusion of staccato what it sounds like behind the bell being different out front?
Probably. It's been so long for me since I have thought about that. Um, for me, it's a lot about what I'm hearing in my head through the bones and and that's what you're talking about being behind the bell, what we're hearing, because we hear so much through our,
Yeah.
Our bone structure.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that's where recording yourself, and, I'm still shocked to this day. I still, a lot of times play too short.
Yeah.
I have that so ingrained in my sort of playing lexicon. I just have a hard time. And so I have to remind myself to play longer.
Yeah, because it always sounds a little shorter out in front than it does behind the
Mhm.
bell. And so
Well, and I have you ever been to Houston, Mark?
yes.
Have you been in our hall?
Yeah, just for about 6 excerpts.
Okay. Well, and you heard it when no one's in the hall much, and that's at its best. It's a black hole of that back wall is so far from the stage that it is not a resonant place. And
Yeah.
if we start playing too short, you die.
Yeah.
I would not have had this job as long as I had if I played wrong.
Yeah.
It would have killed me. You'll die a short death in a hall like this.
Yeah.
I am forced to play correctly because if I don't, I'm going to hurt myself.
Yeah.
And there are a few halls that are like that in this country. Ours, I think, is maybe the worst at that because it's just huge. Seats 3,000 people, and there's no real reverb. But there are a few other halls like that. But those orchestras, if you'll notice, there's a continuity of style. And we all tend to play a little heavier and a little longer because we have to.
Yeah. 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 What were the and Mr. Chickles was still playing a good bit when you were in school. Am I right about
Yeah,
that?
he was still playing. He wasn't playing in the orchestra when I got into school.
Right.
He had been retired out of the orchestra for about 5 years.
Right.
But he still played. He played some chamber music concerts with the Stockholm Philharmonic Brass. He played with a group called the Chicago Brass Works with Luther Didrikson. I remember sliding in and hearing him playing second trumpet to Luther. And, you see me smiling because, I wish I could take all of you back and let you hear what Chickowitz sounded like in that group, but his sound was phenomenal.
Yeah.
Tit for tat, it was the perfect sound to go with Bud. It just a incredible, vibrant, huge mass.
You can hear some of it's not maybe the best mic quality, but there are those master classes he did at Northwestern, some of those summers.
Mm-hmm.
People can find on the Northwestern University website, which you can hear him start to play Arban etudes and the articulation we're talking about, because that's
absolutely.
I always feel like that's just such a component of his teaching that is sometimes glossed over. That because we know
I'm glad to hear you say that because I think that is very true.
Yeah.
That is the complete picture. And I will tell you, by the time, especially if you were in what he would call the 4-year plan,
right,
the undergraduates most of the time historically have outplayed the grad students at the school. My senior year was probably the biggest exception. Most of my freshman class had dropped out of school and changed majors or gone elsewhere, different things. And so we had a lot of grad students that came in, and we had a very uniquely talented grad class.
Yeah.
And so my senior year, I think I was the only performance major. Schoonover might have been a performance major. But there were only 3 of us undergrads. And then we had a grad class of Kevin Hartman, Neil Berenson, Tom Rolfs. We all know who Tom is, right?
Mm-hmm.
We had several, and I'm leaving people out. Greg Holland was in that class, who's a local freelancer in Atlanta with you. And I'm forgetting one other person I know. Ed Kuhn was in that class. And there were just terrific players. But by and large, the undergraduates outperformed them because Chikowitz had more time with us to uncover every problem, and which included all the articulations and checking out single, double, triple, legato, you name it.
Yeah.
You know, he did it. My Arvin book is marked up like you wouldn't believe.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and what, outside of the flow, so we obviously use the flow studies with you guys, those etudes.
You know what though? He used them very little. We were just bumping on them a little bit at the beginning of every lesson. He would say usually, have you played some today? Yes, I have. Why don't you play a couple of my long tones just to get familiar with the horn again? And that's it. And as long as you played those and you were executing well, that was it.
Yeah.
Now, somebody else might be having a problem and have to do those again, but I never did. I just played one or two of them and that was it. What's that?
But the flow study etudes though.
Right, he did. Now the flow study books that you have done, on the 259. What is the publishing? Yeah, Studio 259. Those books are wonderful to have. We did not have them, of course, in book form.
Right.
He did that later. We just had individual photocopies, and he would just hand us one every week to work on for the next lesson. And that was the first main etude we would play in each lesson.
Okay. And then what were the etudes that you generally did that were not in that collection? Like Arvin etudes or Charlier's, and it's kind of typical.
Say that question again. It garbled on.
Outside of those sort of the flow study etudes that we later put in the books, what were his etude choices with you? Was it like Arvin characteristic studies and Charlier or Biche?
I did a few of the Arvin characteristic studies, but not many. I think maybe 2 or 3. Did a lot of Charlier later. As a freshman, we started out with the Saxa book, which I still to this day don't like. So I don't teach out of it, but some people love it and they still do better. I'm not a big Saxa fan. Then we would go from Saxa into Bousquet, and I worked through most all of the Bousquet book. Let's see. For me, I was always a big, heavy, loud player, as you know. And that hasn't changed. I was that way, I think, from birth. He worked me out of the 70 Little Studies book by Clodomir. And I still to this day, you can ask Michael Wilkinson sometime. That was my gift to him when he got here. He played a year as second trumpet to me, and he played a lot like what I play like. We can provide a lot of jet exhaust if we get excited.
Right.
And I brought him a present one day, and I brought him in 70 Little Studies by Clodomir, and I said, this book will eventually mean a lot to you. And I gave him the book, and it didn't take him long before he said, oh, this is amazing. And I'm sure he still plays out of the book. I have several of them memorized. Yeah. We're working on that aspect of playing that doesn't come naturally to us. If you're a fastball pitcher who likes to throw 100 miles an hour all the time, you're a better fastball pitcher if you've got a great changeup.
Right.
And that's what the Clodomir does. And so if you've got somebody that's a really good changeup pitcher, you don't need to work with them on Clodomir. They've already got that. Right. And they're going to work on Brandt.
Yeah.
Well, I never worked on Brandt. I have never prepared a Brandt study for anybody. Can you believe that? Hard to believe. And I've been playing in an orchestra for almost 30 years.
Wow.
Entitled position the whole time, right? So, but I didn't do Brandts. So it depends on what your needs are and what your natural gifts are. And Chikowitz was great at that. So I didn't use Brand. I was using Clodomir. We also did, after I finished the Bousquet book, we went into top tones for the trumpeter. And, Phil, he would have sort of that category of technique. And on the lyrical side, we started out early on with Bordoni, of doing the 24 Bordonis with transposition.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you know that book or not. It's great. I still use it to teach out of. And those are wonderful. And then when I graduate out of that, I put people into the Rochu book.
Right.
And the Rochu books. And I insist on them using bass clef books, trombone books, and not the trumpet versions. Sorry, no offense to anybody out there. I just want my kids to be transposing all the time. That was Chickowitz's big thing.
Yeah.
I never remember playing anything where it was written. I mean, we transpose everything, even the flow studies.
Yeah.
Those flow studies we transpose everything.
Yeah. Now, and that actually leads me to a question about you, and I want to go into some of the other teachers you had, but when did you basically play C trumpet exclusively? Because you're not a B flat guy very often. How can I, what else to say that?
The funny thing is, for not being a B flat player, and I'm trying to think right now, the last time I played B flat was in July. And I soloed on a Tico Tico with our brass section. And so I used one of my two oldest B flats. I have 4 New York Bach B flat trumpets that I have. The oldest is made in 1936. And then I have one that was made in 1946, a medium bore. It sounds phenomenal, like electrifying. And I used it on Tico Tico. It was just great.
I feel like I saw that, and I just thought, well, this is 2020.
I will tell you, I started playing C trumpet exclusively.
Yeah.
Buckle in here. When I got my first C trumpet, which was I think I just turned 16. And so my last 2 years of high school, I played C trumpet and band exclusively.
Wow.
Transposed everything. I took all state auditions on my C trumpet, transposing them. I transposed my sight reading. I play down a whole step better than I read where it's written. That's how bad the disease has gotten.
Did Chickowitz have an opinion about that? Did he want you to play more B flat?
He did. He pinged me about it, and I had a Bach B flat, model 37, that I had gotten when I was in 7th grade. And I didn't like to play it. And he would say, Mark, you need to play it. It's good for your sound. It's good to play something. And so he would assign one etude on a B flat trumpet every week for me to make me play B flat. And he it was okay because he got it, because Herseth didn't play B flat, like never, and a lot of people didn't, but he wanted me to do that to enhance my sound and to get it to be a little bit, I think, rounder and fatter at the time, and to get that in my ear to make sure that B flat sound didn't go away.
Right.
And so I was playing it and struggling on it, again. And one day in a lesson, this is a true story. I don't know. Hopefully Mike won't call in and complain about this, but Chickwitz picked up my horn and he played it, and he stopped and he looked at me and he said, Mark, this is the worst Bach B flat trumpet I have ever played in my entire life. I can see why you don't like to play B flat. This horn is awful.
Yeah.
Do you have access to any other B flat trumpet? And I said, well, my brother has a Bach. It's a 43. It's not a 37, but he's got a Bach B flat that you can use. I mean, I think I can use. And he said, how long will it take you to get it? And I said, well, my dad works for Delta. He can fly it up to me. I can have it probably by next week. And he said, why don't you do that? So my dad did bring the horn up to me, and so I used that the rest of the time I was at Northwestern and played that 43. Yeah. But the funny story here, and I guess I'm going to share this because I'm just going to. About a month later, I get a phone call. You didn't get phone calls from Vincent Chikowitz. Come on, that's just unheard of. But he had looked evidently on my record and found my phone number. And he calls me in my dorm. And I get the phone call from him. And he said, Mark, this is Vince Chikowitz. I said, hello, Mr. Chikowitz. And he said, do you still have that B flat trumpet that's so bad? And I said, I do. And he said, do you want to sell it? And I said, I do. And he said, well, I think I have the perfect sucker for that horn. And, this is like God saying that to me. This is Mr. Chikowitz. And I couldn't help but chuckle a little bit. And then I said, well, who is it? And he said, well, we have two concertmasters in the Chicago Symphony, and one of them has a son that is a conducting student down at either DePaul or Roosevelt. I don't remember which one. I think it was maybe DePaul. And he said, and he's needing an ensemble instrument. And, he's never going to be good enough to know the difference. So I figure he's kind of the perfect guy for us to sell it to. And I said, that sounds awesome. And he said, do you know what you paid for that horn? And I said, well, my parents paid $3.25 for it back when I was in 7th grade. And he goes, well, do you think 300 would be okay? And I said, yes. And he said, well, I'll make sure it happens. And I said, wait, one more question. I don't have a case for it. And he said, do you have a brown paper bag? And I said, I can get one. And he said, just take it to him in a brown paper bag. It'll be fine. So I sold him. I sold him the horn and got $300 bills for a trumpet in a brown paper bag that I sold. That was all arranged for by Vince Chikowitz. And kind of nice. It's not what we think of when we think of Vincent Chikowitz, but there's that human side of him. So.
There are deals to be made all the time.
So a deal to be made, and we got rid of that awful B flat trumpet for me. And then I played my brothers through the rest of school. And then, I think the only B flat I bought after that, I drop shipped a Yamaha Mark II after I was in the Atlanta Symphony, I think. Somehow I got that job with either borrowing a B flat or maybe, I don't know, maybe I had found an old B flat for cheap or something. But, you only need it. You can get by usually except for one excerpt, if they're asking Heldenleben or something.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. Very funny. Well, another aspect of that lineage is Luther Didrikson. Could you talk a little bit about him?
Luther was probably the most underrated trumpet teacher that I've ever had. And to this day, I probably access as much of Luther Didrikson's teaching when I play and perform as anybody.
Yeah.
And that's he was a wonderful player. He was a really skillful teacher. He provided a very practical view of, Chikowitz had already been out of the orchestra for 5 years. And like I said, he was kind of grandfatherly and gentle with how he handled us most of the time. I have one exception to that story, but most of every other time was very gentle and kind. And Luther was just a younger guy, very, very practical minded, and would just be straight shooting with you. Like he might say, Mark, that mouthpiece sounds bad. That sounds like that mouthpiece is too big for you.
Yeah.
Where Chikowitz, I don't think would ever say that. He might finagle you onto another piece of equipment, but Luther was very direct and worked on a lot of the same things. Luther had studied with Chikowitz for his undergraduate and a master's. So if there was anybody that could teach, co-teach with Chikowitz, it was Luther. And so nothing ever conflicted. It was just, how we would work so that Chikowitz could teach 36 people.
Right.
So we would get a Luther lesson, like 2 for Chikowitz, 1 with Luther kind of thing. And I thought Luther was a terrific asset for me.
Yeah, yeah. And then you did take some lessons both with Herseth and with Jacobs. Let's go with Jacobs.
Right. I studied more with Herseth than I did with Jacobs. I really only had 1 lesson with Arnold Jacobs. And it was good. It was great. It was the normal first lesson spiel that you get. And it was really awesome, and nothing earth shattering. I just wanted to see what it was all about. And and it was, he liked my playing and all of that. He had a few suggestions for breathing and opening up a little bit more, but real standard kind of stuff with Jacobs. And there's a lot that you take away just from being around someone like that. You get a little of the dust, the gold dust on you, and it lasts for a while. And I mean, we've all had that experience, right?
Right.
You study with somebody that, you're around, you're good friends with sax.
Yeah.
And you probably feel like every time you're around him, you're getting a little bit of sax on you, and it's good for you.
Yeah.
You get around people with those kind of bigger than life personalities, and they've got it figured out in the way they play, and it can't help but get on you, and it's a good thing. Well, that's the way my time around Jacobs was. And I socialized with Jacobs once up at the Brass House. He came for a whole day with his wife and had a barbecue and stuff. And so there's a lot of Jake stories. And my dearest friend, Charlie Shookett, a tuba player up in Chicago, studied with him every week for about 4 years or more. And we would compare notes. And so I feel like there's a lot of the Jake-isms that I have, even though I only had the 1 lesson. I've have stored almost, I don't know, probably several hundred Jake quotes that I have in a file. And those Jake quotes I use all the time. I mean, he was so good at that. Herseth, on the other side, I studied much more with and worked with him. Herseth was a different kind of teacher for me. I think some other people might not see it the same way I did. Herseth was giving me validation, and we didn't talk about anything. I mean, in a year, he said 1 technical thing to me. And this is really honest to God what he said. He said, "Mark, you might want to use a da tongue there." That's real deep, right? I mean, that's what I got. A lot of it was playing it and him saying, "Yeah," or, "Why don't you do it like this?" Or that kind of thing. A little bit of copying and hearing him play. And once again, being around him and getting a little of that gold dust on me.
Right.
But that was more of what my exposure was with Herseth. I learned more from Herseth, and still do, from listening to the records and recordings. Live recordings are, like, obviously even better. But there's nothing like going back and seeing that video of, say, Herseth playing first trumpet on the Hindemith brass, with Hindemith conducting. I mean, come on. How lucky are we that we can access that, right? He recorded that right after I was born, and we didn't have enough time to discuss that rep in a lesson.
Right.
And that rep doesn't come up very often in life. I've only performed it maybe twice in my career. And I mean, every time I do, I go back and I listen to that, and that to me is the definitive. And so that's how I studied with Herseth more than being in the room with him. Truthfully, I mean, he wasn't a skilled teacher for me.
Right.
He was a validator. And when I did it well enough that I got his approval, then I felt like, now, as he even said, if it's good enough for me, then it's good enough for anybody. He would say that sometimes. Where, Chikowitz was much more of the trumpet teacher. I think Herseth just spit shined me.
You mentioned catchphrases, because every teacher's got theirs. Get- Were there any, I mean, I know you said you only saw Jacobs once, but between those three guys, were there phrases or catchphrases that really stuck out to you that you heard a lot or you still remember?
I have such a horrible memory. And as soon as we get off here, I'm going to have like 100 of them come up because they come up when I teach.
Right.
And there's something, and I'll have a little flashback of something that Luther might say or that Chickowitz might say. And I have a few, that's why I have I saved the quotes. One of my favorites, Jake is probably my favorite person to quote because he's so quotable.
Right.
One of them is strength is your enemy, weakness is your friend, which goes completely against the grain of what we trumpet players like to think, right? If I'm just stronger, I'm going to be able to do this better.
Yeah.
But it's wrong. It's about the technique, not the strength, right?
Right.
And, and I love that one. Strength is your enemy, weakness is your friend. Another one is the one that he does. If you can't accept crudity, you cannot create quality. Right. And, that is my life's mantra. Don't be afraid of making an ugly sound. There are so many players that are just tied up in knots out of fear of making an ugly sound. And some of the most highly respected players suffer from this. And they, I'm sure, have to tell themselves that too. Live on the edge, take a chance. Yeah. Because if you're really going to create quality, you have to take chances and you've got to risk it. Yeah. And even though you don't have the chops and you feel weak, oh yeah, you can back off and hide in the weeds and play it safe and go home and lie to yourself and tell yourself that you really did something, but you hid in the weeds and you played it safe. Or you can be like Nolan Ryan and you come in and you throw it still as hard as you can and somebody plunks it out of the stadium and it's a home run occasionally. Yeah. But then again, I'll put Nolan Ryan's career next to like almost anybody's, right? Yes, he gave up a few home runs in his life. Yeah, when you're throwing that hard, the batter doesn't have to provide a whole lot of energy, right? Right. But man, probably one of the most terrifying, Roger Clemens, same way, one of the most terrifying. Can you imagine standing in the batter box and having that guy throwing that kind of heat at you? I'm like, no, I'll stick to trumpet.
Especially with the steroids. but so that was kind of your time in Northwestern though. Did you go back and see Chickowitz over the years?
I only went back to see him with a horn once. And I had switched from playing Bach to Yamaha back in the early 90s. Actually, it was 1990. But I played on the Yamaha for a while. And after I won the Atlanta job in 94, I think I went up in like 1995 or 96 and had a lesson with him. And I was wanting to make sure, what he thought and how I was doing and to see what he thought of the Yamaha. And I had, this was, early days of the Malone Yamaha conversion thing. And I played some excerpts and different things for him. And he said, Mark, I generally don't like the Yamaha, the way people sound on Yamahas, but I really like what you sound like on this horn. And he goes, so I don't think you need to, I really think you sound good on it. So just whatever, if it's working like that, stay on it. And that was what once again, I was going looking for validation for someone to tell me that it was okay to play the Yamaha for many years, which I did. I played Yamaha for a long time, probably almost 30 years before, getting exposed back to the Bach. And I'm back on the Bach now for 3 years and loving it. So,
yeah. Well, and kind of before we leave that Chicago topic, I mean, what if you were to list, I don't know, 5 of your favorite recordings, which is difficult to do. If you were to tell somebody now who has not heard them as a student, these are the 5 recordings you got to really know? What would they be?
Well, one of them, my favorite one was actually one that Herseth was his favorite recording. And that was the one that was with Reiner that he did Prokofiev, Lieutenant Kiji on one side, I believe it was. And the flip side was Song of the Nightingale,
Yeah.
Stravinsky. And, I got to play Song of the Nightingale on tour in the UK about a decade ago. And once again, I've heard that recording so many times that it becomes, and you learn from just duplicating. If you're making a similar sound to Bud Herseth doing it, you're doing it the way he's doing it, and it makes you better. And then you can use that sweet, velvety, fluffy sound for those lovely chorale sort of melodies, lyrical melodies. And if you can do it in that piece, you can use it all over the place.
Yeah.
Some of the other recordings, any of the Reiner Strausses, any of them. I own so much. I think I own everything Reiner did with the orchestra. That's the best stuff in the business. So it's hard to single one out in particular. I love the old Heldenleben. I wore that out because that was Chickwitz's first recording, and he was playing first E flat. And back in that day, they just went right down the line. It was 1, 2, and 3 on the first 3 B flat parts, and the fourth trumpet played first E flat, and they brought in an extra to play second E flat.
You knew who the section was?
So, pardon?
You knew who the section was for that?
Well, as far as I know, it was Bud playing first. Rudy Nation was playing second, who was just awesome.
Yeah.
And the third trumpet, I'm not positive.
It was
I'm thinking, pardon?
Catarabic.
Yeah, was it Catarabic at that time?
Mm-hmm.
That would have been probably my guess, but I wasn't sure if Schilke was still there or not, or exactly what.
Schilke was second E flat.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go.
Yeah.
There you go. That was Chickwitz's very first recording. He said, man, I was scared to death, just because, they didn't do a whole heck of a lot of editing back then.
No.
And as the battle scene kept going, I think they recorded it all on a Saturday, and they spent like 7.5 hours or something recording Heldenleben. And they're just about to bleed, all of them. And every take was like, this could be the one, right?
Yeah.
There were only a few spots where they could edit, and back in those days, and there was a lot of added pressure. If everybody and things were going really well, you didn't want to be the person that screwed it up. So that's a favorite of mine. There's so many good ones, though. Anything. I also really like Seiji Ozawa conducting the Chicago Symphony. Those are some real favorite special times of repertoire. Giulini always did really good recordings with the Chicago Symphony. And then, of course, if you can get a hold of the Nielsen 4 with Martineau, that is great. Like you said, it's hard, and it's very hard for me. One other life-changing recording, there's 2 of them I'll mention. Herseth does something that very few trumpeters today even can do. There is maybe a handful, I would say, that can do this well. And when Herseth did it, no one could do it. He's the only person at that time doing this. But in the late 1950s, there's a recording of Reiner doing Das Lied von der Erde. And that lyrical soft solo in the first movement, which I have been lucky enough to play and record in Houston, and I got to play it for three nights up in Chicago about 4 years ago. And it's scary, no doubt about it, but you get used to the fear and sitting in the job for a while. But when Bud was doing that, nobody got that sound. I'd never heard it on any. Maybe there's somebody, but I have yet to hear it in that time period.
Yeah.
And Bud gets this velvety, flute-like quality when he goes in the upper register. And it took me years and years and years of sort of futzing around and moving things around and doing different things to find how to make that really work. And Herseth was the first. And I think if you listen to that, and he also uses that technique a lot, but another good example of it is the Giulini Mahler 9
Yeah.
that he did. It won the Grand Prix de Disc. And it's just stunning. And you think, how can a trumpet change color that extreme? And you think, well, where did Herseth get it? I mean, did he get transported in some portal to a far, far galaxy and get exposed to that? Because no one knew a trumpet could make that sound. Yeah. And of course, after he did it, I'm sure everyone, it was electrified. Trumpet players like, whoa, how is he doing that? Yeah. And I think that's frustrated a lot of players because it's, for me, it's the ultimate. You have to trust yourself beyond belief, because what you have to do on the inside of your mouth to make that sound defies logic. Right. It's like you're putting a golf ball in your mouth, but you're playing high C's. Yeah. And that does not equate for the average player. Right. But that's how you get that sound. And the airspeed is very slow. And we usually think that the speed of the air is going to be really fast up high. Yeah. Yeah. It doesn't equate, but when you do it, man, is it beautiful. You know? Yeah. Yeah. So those would be the ones I think, if I had to put a life-changing recordings, those would be my favorite ones.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And several people are kind of watching and saying hi, because Tony Frisk is watching and he's mentioning the Ozawa Bartok concerto recording, which is
absolutely,
which is a great.
Those Ozawa ones are just awesome. Tell Tony I said hello. We were texting earlier today.
Yeah, Tony, and a lot of people are watching. Stanford Thompson, who grew up here in Atlanta, of course, he mentioned hearing you play pictures in around 2000 with the ASO, and just, that convinced him to become a professional trumpet player. So,
oh, tell him thank you. That's really sweet. I remember that concert. We had a French conductor, and I cannot think of his name. It was also his father was a very famous conductor. And we had Ravel G major on the same program.
Of course,
we did Ravel G major in the first half with Alicia Del Rocha playing. She was up in the years at that point, but lucky to get to do that program. Yeah.
This is nothing to do with either one of us, but I will tell you, and just maybe people will think this story is funny. But Phil Smith's nearby now. I've seen him a couple times, and we went to dinner with him and Brandon because they came up to hear Stewart play the Jolivet second concerto about a year and a half ago. And I asked Phil, I said, so when you made the excerpt CD, for there to be a big pregnant pause when you talked about the Ravel piano concerto after you said, well, good luck? And he just kind of looked away and smiled and didn't answer. He's very funny. He's very funny. So
that's my least favorite. That's my least favorite excerpt.
Oh, of course.
And you wouldn't think necessarily the way I play, you would not really think, when I was younger, I used to single tongue it all, and I had a lot of success with it. And one thing, as you get older, your single tongue, I think, does get slower, and you learn to multiple tongue a little bit more, which you have to, I think that's something most players, as they get older in the orchestra, you realize there's a benefit to that. Yeah. But it's so weird for me. For some reason, I had a bad go at it with some auditions, professional auditions early on with nerves. And, I still, like, some of them I've had and I conquered and I'm fine with. I had that same problem with Don Juan early in my career, and I conquered that one. And I've played Don Juan loads of places and played it very well. I got to play it up in Pittsburgh with oh, what's his name?
Neil, George.
No, I'm talking about the conductor, the real famous Gustavo Dudamel,
Oh, yeah.
and getting to play, first on Don Juan with Dudamel. I mean, yeah, yeah. I was still on the Yamaha, and I think I kind of pretty much ripped that bell to shreds at that point because he was so exciting. He really was. But I don't, it's Ravel Piano Concerto has always been something I have to really lay for, and and for me, it just works a little bit better to pull out a D trumpet for that. I practice it most every day on a C trumpet. But when I perform it, I usually go back and I find it easier on my Mount Vernon C that I play every day now than any horn I've ever played it on. But if I were performing it, tomorrow, I'd probably pull out my D trumpet.
And by the way, Don Kagan says you sounded great on the Das Lied he's talking about. I guess Don heard.
What's that?
Don Kagan heard your Das Lied in Chicago.
Oh, yes, Don Kagan was there. Tell him hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, man. I remember seeing Don up there. Yeah, that was, getting to sit in that seat is, of course, it's a thrill. But there's so many other things that go into, your mental makeup, and there's so many emotions that were going on. It was hard to calm my spirit each night. I probably was more prepared for that than I normally am, but I always feel like, you always feel like you could prepare more. But something about I was in Chris Martin's chair too, but I've still viewed that like Bud Herseth's chair. And I know Chris Martin, and I know he's a human being, and we're friends, and I can handle that. But for some reason, knowing it was Bud's chair, and I'm sure Chris got over that very quickly, but it was like I was sitting somewhere that was hallowed ground. And it's still, every time I sit there, it's that way. I see in the hall, and when I was in Civic, it was somehow okay to be in that chair. But being with the Chicago Symphony, and then you look to your left, and there's Jay Friedman, who was there for how many years, how many decades with Bud.
Yeah.
And you look in front of you, and there's Dan Gingrich. And I remember seeing Dan Gingrich play great when I was, in my teens. And here I am getting to hear these guys, and it was literally, it's a dream come true. But then again, there's all kinds of this emotional stuff that you have to just learn to shut off, because if not, you're not going to play well.
Yeah.
And just an interesting, what a treat. I mean, very lucky.
And after all that, you moved back to Atlanta to freelance. Is that right?
That is true. I got to study with Herseth by being in Civic.
Right.
And I'd been there for 5 years, and I had contemplated going to grad school. And if I had, if I'd say I've gotten lucky enough to get into Juilliard, I would have been at Juilliard with Bilger and I think Sachs at that time. But I mean, I didn't know who they were at that time. I mean, they were just students. I didn't know. Yeah. Hindsight, that would have been kind of a cool place to be.
Yeah.
But I didn't know. And so I was trying to figure out what to do. And Charlie and Barbara had just gotten to Eastman, and I didn't know much other than I wasn't sure. And I thought, well, why go study with someone who studied with Chikowitz when I could just either study with Chikowitz more, or I felt like I was done, there. Chikowitz had kind of, said you're done. And I thought, well, maybe I should try for Civic. And I did that, and I got into Civic and was studying with Herseth. And after that 1 year, it was the worst winter ever. And on Christmas Eve, I had played 7 masses on Christmas Eve and Christmas morning. And it was 26 below zero actual temperature, 81 below wind chill. And, where you live in Atlanta now, it gets a little chilly there. I really like Houston because, like today it was 72 degrees or something. I was dying. And I was scared to death, Mark, that I was going to freeze to death and die. I was having to go out and start my car in between every mass and let it run for 30 minutes just so the gear shifter would move.
Right.
And so after that year, it came to May, I went up, I got the courage up to go see Herseth. And I said, Mr. Herseth, I'm not presuming that I would get into civic again. But there tends to be this pattern that if you're in civic one year, you tend to get in the second year. And I would love that. And that would be awesome. However, I want your blessing to just leave now and to go home.
Yeah.
I mean, I literally said that to him, and I said to go home, and I said, I will tell you why. I've grown up and lived my whole life in a more moderate climate, and this winter did me in. And I don't think I can live through another one of these winters. And he chuckles, like, and he goes, yes, these winters aren't for everybody. And he goes, I'm from, Norwegian country, I'm from Minnesota. And he goes, and so this is something that's even hard for me. And I said, well, I just feel like if I stay here, even if it's not bad weather, it's time for me to go be a professional player.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid if I stay here, I'm going to think of myself as a student forever. And I do want to be a student forever, but I don't want to be a student forever. And he said, I understand. And he goes, and you have my blessing. He goes, go and play up a storm. And that was sort of it. And that's how we parted. And I moved back to Atlanta. And, I did have contacts in the Atlanta Symphony because I'd been subbing with them from the time I was 17. And so there were some, guaranteed sub work there. And then I set up a teaching studio, very much like what you're doing right now, with COVID. You live a lot off your teaching and hope the gigging comes along. It's just unfortunate. Right now, no one has any gigging. But my gigging picked up. I won a position in the Atlanta Ballet Orchestra with Pete Bond.
Mm-hmm.
And I was also met Kevin Eisensmith, who was a terrific player out at the Fort Mac band, was one of the field bands and was a terrific player. And the three of us, they welcomed me in with open arms, and we gigged a lot. We all were very comfortable. We made lots of money, and if I couldn't do a job, I would give it away. And they were very gracious. They were working more than I was, and they would give me their leftovers. And it wasn't long before my calendar was pretty much full. And I freelanced for almost a decade there before getting in the Atlanta Symphony.
Yeah.
And I was making so much money, it was too much money actually, because I wouldn't take very many auditions. I would only take 52-week orchestra auditions. And so they didn't come up very often.
Yeah.
So
yeah. So that must have been a lot of heat when the ASO audition came up, because then you could be home.
It was a lot of heat, because I dreamt of that job of being in the Atlanta Symphony. And at that time, I didn't think I was good enough to be a principal player. I thought I was the pretty much prime example of what a good assistant or associate principal might be. I had the chops to play principal. I didn't think I had the confidence, the self-confidence to play principal. I still don't, to tell you the truth, but I didn't then for sure. And so because of that, I really thought that was my job.
Yeah.
I mean, I wanted that job, and it was for the first time in my life, Mark, that I really, really prepared for a job.
Wow. So what was that preparation like for you? What were the new things that you did?
I still to this day say, record yourself a lot. And it's because I was recording myself occasionally, and it was very difficult back then to record yourselves. I would have killed to have had, all the devices we have now that you can carry in your pocket and just record yourself. Back then I had to like unload the trunk of your car to bring it in with mic stands and mic cables and everything just to record yourself. And I didn't do it a lot, but when I did for the Atlanta audition, I recorded every excerpt many times until I got Mark Hughes playing that excerpt the best I could play that excerpt.
Yeah.
And I put together a master of basically the Atlanta Symphony list being Mark Hughes's greatest hits. So that's exactly how Mark Hughes played the opening to Pictures when he played it, what I thought was the best I could do. That's pretty good when you can get it, like if we could all play our very best, oh my gosh, right?
Yeah.
And that's what I did. And I made this whole recording of the whole list, every excerpt that I thought they were going to ask. And I had Mark Hughes's greatest hits, and I started brainwashing myself with it. I listened to that a lot, and I was proud of it. I thought it was really good. And that was in my head of the only way I knew to play opening to Pictures is the way I play Pictures at my best. The only way I can play Petrushka is the way I play it at my best. That was sort of literally brainwashing.
Yeah.
And I had done that until, every excerpt on there, and there were a couple, that we all have that, you're going to have to hit every day, because if you don't, you suck and you can't play it.
Yeah.
Well, I had done all that work, and I was playing for people. I remember going and playing for Mike Moore. I remember going and playing for Joe Walthall. I played for Jim Thompson. I can remember playing opening to Pictures for Jim Thompson in the locker room downstairs in the Woodruff Arts Center. And I'm in the middle of playing it, and he reaches up with his leg and kicks the music stand across the floor. Music splayed out everywhere, and I finished the excerpt before stopping. And when I finished, he looked at me and he said, "You're ready." And I said, "Well, I hope so." And he goes, "No, no, 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 no. You're ready." And he said, "I did that. I do this occasionally to break someone's concentration." And he goes, "You didn't flinch. You just played all the way through that just remarkably well." He goes, "You're going to do just fine. Now get out of here." And he said, and so for whatever reason, that was like a vote of confidence. And I walked out of there feeling pretty good about myself. Like I was ready to go.
Wow.
And then I got sick, and about 2 days before my audition time, I was throwing up. And I'm like Jerry Seinfeld. I don't ever throw up. I just don't throw up.
Yeah.
And the last time I threw up was in 1994, the 2 days before that audition. And I threw up a whole day and the next day. And I literally remember, and I'm a pretty religious guy, as I think I'm pretty religious. And I'm sitting there praying, "Please, God, make this stop. I'm so sore I can't move." And I'm like, "God, if I'm this nervous that I'm throwing up like this, man, I can't handle this job." And I didn't know what was going on. And I finally, wasn't throwing up anymore because I had nothing else to throw up. And I was so sore. I remember calling the orchestra and telling them I could not come to the audition, as painful as that was to say, because I was so sick. And Joe Walthall was the personnel manager at that point.
Yeah.
And so Joe said, "Mark, tell you what we can do. We can give you a time tomorrow. It's the last day of prelims. Why don't you come in the last hours at 3:00? Why don't you come in at 3:00 and we'll try to work you in?" And I said, "Okay, I hope I'm feeling better." And he goes, I do too. So I come in on that day and I played in the last hour, and I played, and it turns out I got a unanimous decision. I didn't, of course, know this at the time, but later was able to ask. And then I had a semifinal like right after that, and I hadn't eaten anything. I mean, in like 2.5 days. I mean, I'd had some water, but I mean, I was weak. And I remember every excerpt thinking, if I would quote a verse of scripture to myself, and if I thought, if I screw this up, I'm not going to have enough chops to do it twice. And which was a great motivator, by the way, because when you can't do it twice, somehow you get it out. And I made it through the semis, and I also got a unanimous decision then. And then we had the first round of finals that night, and this was after 10 p.m. And in between, I'm laying down and sleeping in between rounds, by the way. That's how weak I was. And when they got down to that round of finals, there were 10 people still. So it was really like a semi, but they called it finals. And there were 10 of us, and I played. And when they finished, they said, I think they called us all back in. It was a little before midnight. And they said, we can't come up with a decision. We've got 3 people that we'd like to hear, and we're going to hear you next Sunday. We'll fly you back in and all that stuff. And my heart kind of sank when they said that.
Yeah.
That they would fly us back in, because of course I lived in Atlanta. And I thought, well, oh well, it was a good run. And when they called out the names, I was one of the 3. Paul Randall was one of them, and what's his name up in Toronto? Principal player, fabulous player.
Andy Mccandless?
Yes, Andrew Mccandless, who had been playing out in San Francisco. He's one of my favorite players, by the way. Beautiful player, who takes lots of chances. Beautiful player, and does his own thing, and I love that. At any rate, Andy was in the finals. He was young. He was much younger than I was. And so the 3 of us were in the finals, and the next week we came back and had our final round, and then I was lucky enough to win the job.
Wow. Wow.
Which was great. And I was able to, eat during that week. So I was feeling much better.
I bet your stomach went just fine after that was all done.
Well, you could tell I have a little extra caloric, adage on my body, so I can go a few days without eating. It works.
You're making up for those 2 days.
That's it.
By the way, Bruce Bryan, you mentioned, thanks for inviting him to play with the Millar Brass Ensemble in 1983.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yes, we had I tell him thank you too. I mean, Bruce and I, we Zoomed together our graduating class. And you know what? I left him off the list. That's who it was. He was in the grad class with Tom Rolfs and all the guys. Oh, I'm such an idiot. Sorry, Bruce. We were just on a Zoom call like a week ago. So that's how good my memory is. Bruce and I, he was playing first in the wind ensemble at Northwestern when we went on tour of the Northeast, the end of my senior year, at the end of his graduate year.
Yeah.
And I got to play second to Bruce. I wasn't in wind ensemble. I'd been playing principal in the orchestra all year, and Painter called me and asked me to go. And he said, the only thing is you aren't going to be playing first. And I said, that's all right. And I was lucky enough I got to play second to Bruce the whole time. So lucky me.
He's like the perfect college teacher, right? He sounds beautiful all the time, and all of his students do too. And he's as nice a guy as you could ever meet.
We were doing, speaking of Chicklets, we were doing a tribute to him at an ITG up in Massachusetts. Probably, it was right after Mr. Chicklets had died. And we got together, and we were all staying out at Tom Rolf's cabin. It's actually a really nice house. It's not a cabin. Out in the Berkshires. And so we were doing our normal guy thing, drinking too much, smoking too many cigars, and the whole bit. And so we were all warming up and playing, and I'm always everybody's little toy dog, Mark, play us some more high notes, and ripping my face off and everything. And Tom sits back and just is in control and laughing at me and doing things. And Tom and I noticed were very similar in the fact that, we sounded good, we really did, and we're strong and all of that. And then the second players, Bob Dorr was in from Minnesota and Neil Berenson was in from Pittsburgh. And both of those guys kind of had a little bit of jet exhaust in their sounds, because playing second trumpet is the hardest job. I mean, if you ever do that in orchestra, ask Tony Prisk and he'll tell you about it. Playing second trumpet hurts. There are times that you take one for the team every week is what you do. And so I noticed that both of those guys sounded rough, You know, it all functions. It's just there's a damage to the tissue, right?
Right.
And then we had the two college guys. We had Kevin Hartman and Bruce Briney, and we're all jealous as all get up because they sound like $1,000,000, and we're all looking at each other like, what have we been doing to ourselves? You know, both of them, they're warming up, and everything sounds so good. And we started talking about it. It's like, you guys must have a life because everything was perfectly produced. Everything sounded great out of those two. And we thought, man, there you go. They're the best two players in the business right there. So Bruce and Kevin.
Yeah. And Tony Priss just said amen. So
Well, it's true. I mean, it is true. Second trumpet, I did a fall in Atlanta. John Head had a hernia surgery, and I remember playing. This is when I made finals in St. Louis right after this. And I did 8 straight weeks of playing second trumpet on just huge repertoire in Atlanta. And that's when I realized how hard it was.
yeah. Yeah.
And the second trumpet, I don't want that job.
Yeah.
That job's too hard.
Well, and then so you won the audition. You had a lot of great colleagues in the ASO here. You know, because you had Jim Thompson, of course. Later, Chris Martin was a principal, and Larry Black, and then Joe Waffle. Can you kind of talk about, and then Mike Tishone too? I can't forget
Yes.
Yeah,
You know, we had a unique thing when Chris Martin. I mean, I love Jim, and by the way, when you hear me, there's a lot of Herseth in me, which, you know, Chikowitz is just like Herseth. So those two are Vulcan mind melded into the same thing. And if you hear me, then there's a little of that in me. And as I said earlier, there's a good bit of Joe Walthall in me. There's also a good bit of Jim Thompson in me. And there are a lot of things that I play. And so there's a little bit of a Roger Voisin lyricism in the way I play. And that's where I got it from. And Jim is one of my favorite players. He was my first principal player in a major orchestra thing. And you learn so much from this. Yeah. And I think Jim was, in those 8 years that he was in Atlanta, was probably at his absolute peak. Even though those Montreal years were pretty darn awesome.
Yes, they were.
But I will tell you, there would be weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks that he would go by and I didn't hear him miss anything.
Yeah.
He was like Herseth, just a different style.
Yeah.
You know, he was a French Herseth, you know, but so the sound scope was different. Herseth has such a density in the sound, and Jim's has a different form of life to it. They're both beautiful and they're both unique. And I think every player wants that. You want to have your own voice, and Jim had that. So there's a lot of stuff I owe to Jim. And I have, honestly, I've told him that. I mean, of
course,
you have to give credit where it's due. And I was exposed to greatness, and you just absorb what you can and try to be a sponge. But he was a wonderful principal to listen to. And I learned a lot of what I know about trumpet and understanding how I make the trumpet work from listening to Jim Thompson play. Yeah. Up close and personal every day. Well, but after Jim left, I got to play principal for 2 years, acting principal, and then Chris Martin came in. And once Chris Martin was there, the most unique thing, this is probably like old school orchestras, but Chris Martin is principal, and his teacher, primary teacher, was Larry Black until he went to Eastman, right? And he still played for Larry, I'm sure, up until the day he got in the job. Larry's fourth. I'm the associate. My teacher's playing second. And, you know, you would think that's either going to work really well or it's not going to work at all. And it worked really well. Both of those, both my teacher, Joe Walthall, and Larry, Chris's teacher, they both checked their egos and were really, I mean, you know, they both would give us advice because they should. You know, they've only been in the job 30 years. You think they know something, but they are they're very good and supportive about giving us the authority to be their bosses.
Yeah.
And that was a really pretty high functioning trumpet section, I'll have to say. And then of course, after Larry retired, Mike Tishone got the job and came in and has such a, Mike's always had this really beautiful sound. Um, he was my second player, being the fourth player. And, I miss Mike. There are times I miss Mike. I've been fortunate to have a lot of good second players. I got here to Houston, and Tony did a great job for the longest time. When he left and went to Philly, then I've had several others come in and do, Micah filled in for a year, and I would have been very happy to have Micah sit there the rest of my career. And he just had more talent, I guess, and aspirations, and went on. And so after that, then I think Rich played some with us, but then Carrie won the job. She did extremely well. There's some, just listening to a recording she did with us on the West Side Story that we did. She plays like $1 million on that. She sounded great on that. And then unfortunately she left. And then Rich Harris came in and played not a year, but like 3 months with us right before us going to Europe in 2018. And Rich won the principal job in Charlotte the 3 days before our tour, came home and had to play an audition for us a month later or maybe 3 weeks later for our second job. And he won our job very easily, actually. He just sounded like a bazillion bucks. And so, I've been lucky having these great second players to work with.
Yeah. Well, one question I had too was what were the adjustments you made between being an associate principal in that role in Atlanta and then the principal role you have now in Houston?
That's a really good question, Mark, because there's a lot of difference. The biggest thing, like when you're an associate, you are partly you, but you're partly your principal.
Mm-hmm.
So my job was always to be prepared. So I had to prepare, I think, more. And maybe it's because I was also younger, but I was practicing more. But generally, I didn't have to play first on the big tune. I was going to be playing third on the big tune. And that can be still hard if you're doing Alpine Symphony, but a lot of times it's not so bad. If you're not playing a Strauss tone poem or a Mahler symphony, it's okay. You can go a little tired to work.
Yeah.
You're not going to do that and be an effective principal player. So you have to change your practice patterns. And then as an associate, like I said, you're kind of half and halving. I was a little bit of Jim Thompson and a little bit of Mark Hughes.
Yeah.
And when I became principal, I didn't have to be anybody else. And as an associate, you don't ever feel like there's a chair that is yours. Well, see, there's a difference. When I come in to work at the Houston Symphony, I have a chair. My chair is a throne, in my mind. I come in and I sit in that same chair. And other section members do too. The second player knows his chair, but the associate, it's this rotation of in and out. And I think it takes a special flexibility to be a really good associate.
Yeah.
And so that's the biggest change. And one last thing about I think being a principal player, you have to be smarter at how you practice. There's a great I'm trying to think how to say this. You have to trust yourself more, even though you're playing a harder or more exposed, not harder, more exposed part. You've got to trust yourself more because you can't come to work tired. And there's a fine line between being warmed up and worn out, as we know.
Yeah. And
you can't play effectively as a principal trumpet and be worn out. So I front load my weeks. I practice a lot on Monday, Tuesdays, and Wednesdays, and I don't practice so much on Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. And that's so that I sound fresh and am able to do my job and perform better. And in the concert, and still have enough chops to play whatever I have to play at the end. I do not recall running out of gas at the end of a show. I hope that doesn't happen ever. But you've heard those stories, and I don't ever recall. I've been tired. I live tired, but I don't, I think there's a trust factor. Whereas a section player, you can test things 100 times if you want to before the show to make sure you got it. I don't have that luxury, or at least I don't have that kind of strength. There might be somebody that does, but I don't.
Yeah. Yeah. So those days you front load the weeks. What is your fundamentals routine right now? And do you still play etudes and things to keep in shape, or is it mostly?
I do all of those things. Interestingly, I'm so boring. My routine is the same now as it was 30 years ago. Um, you know, Chikowitz, in a way, he never called it a routine. And for me, he didn't really even call it like daily rituals or anything. It's just, he gave you that menu of what he wanted you to do. And, I still to this day, I think I told you earlier, we were chatting,
Yeah.
offline before we started this. And I told you that I had taken 10 days off after Christmas Eve. I played 5 services, and my family, my kids, this might be the last time all 4 of us are able to go on a vacation together. And we drove to North Carolina. And because of the COVID, we just stayed in the house together and hiked and did some things like that. And really enjoyed our time together. And because of that, I didn't want to take a horn. Because when I normally go on vacation, I'll take a horn and I'll play a little, but I just didn't want to do that. So 10 days straight didn't play. And on the 11th day was today, and I started playing. And I did the same thing today I do anytime I'm doing my full routine. I buzz my mouthpiece, just like Chikowitz would say at the top.
Yeah.
I play my long tone studies, and then I do some chromatic work where I stretch myself out very early on, where I go up to high G's above high C on the C trumpet, and I'm meaning a real note. I mean it's a honking high G down to low Fs, as low as I can play on the C trumpet. And I'm stretched out, and then I go into Clark studies, and I do Clark 2, and I do a rotation, a 3-day rotation that gets me through all of the keys. And I do Clark 3, and I do Clark 4, and I do Clark 5, and I do all kinds of different variations of double tonguing, on all these different things. And I intersperse all kinds of arbon in between it, working on triple tongue and double tongue and single tongue speed and all that kind of stuff. And I do this in front of a TV. I hope there's no real young children watching this, but I always have a TV on, just so that it assures me that I have a problem of, once I get started, I have a hard time taking the horn off my face. And a TV provides interruption so that I actually will take a break. And so if I play 3 minutes straight, then I usually will watch TV for 3 or 4 minutes. And then I pick back up and play another 3 minutes straight. If I don't, Mark, I will beat myself into oblivion. And that's no good. But I do that, and I work through, Clarks and Arbans and lip flexibility and different things for about an hour and a half to 2 hours. And then I will come back and do another set. And that's where my etude work comes in, in Bosquets. Usually I use a flow study to get reacquainted with the horn in my second set. And I will do some Bosquets, or always something I go to. And depending on what I feel like doing or what I think I need to work on, maybe it's a Charlier, maybe it's a Longinetti. It can be a lot of different things, because I'm not entertaining myself, but I am trying to vary so I don't get too pigeonholed. And that's what I do. And I do that, like on a Monday of a concert week, I might practice 3 or 4 hours. That's, you know,
Yeah.
2 sets. That's sort of normal. On a Tuesday, depending on if we have a rehearsal or not, right now with COVID, our work weeks are greatly reduced. So it's very easy now, honestly, because I can do my routine Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I'm not used to being able to do everything for 3 straight days. I should sound much better than I do right now. And then once my work starts, I warm up at work. I don't warm up at home. Very rarely do I do that. Maybe I'm getting old and cocky. I don't know, but as long as Tony remembers me, I buzz my mouthpiece in the car in the garage at work, and then I come in and I pick up my horn and start playing. And I play about 10 or 15 minutes, and then I play the rehearsal. And when I finish the rehearsal, if it's a double, I do a double, and I might go home and do nothing. If it's a single rehearsal, I will go home and do some more work.
Yeah.
And usually the routine is greatly diminished, before in warming up for the rehearsal. And then I will do, some a flow study again and some etudes or something like that. On double days, I don't do any practicing. I warm up and play the rehearsal. I warm up and play the show. And that's it. I rarely warm down. I do advise people to warm down. It depends on what kind of playing is going on, and only if you've done damage.
Right.
And if you've done damage, you better warm down. If you are healthily damaged, meaning that you're not forcing and you're blowing the air correctly, and you've just played Strauss tone poem, and you feel like you've played a Strauss tone poem, but you played it well, I don't think that you necessarily need to warm down. I don't. And the next day I'm fine. But sometimes you do. And I think every individual knows that. When you've been cheating a little bit or leaning into it a little more than you should, and you're doing something. And if you don't do some repair work, you're going to pay for it the next day.
Yeah.
I think I've done enough of the basics in my life and consistently, like I said, I've been doing the same routine basically for 30, 35 years, 40 years. And if I've been doing that right, my body has been pretty well trained. And so it's rare that I have a real, like, I got to put myself together day.
Mhm.
In fact, I've only had that I can recall maybe twice, and I was hurt both times before where I'd done something really stupid and hurt myself. Other than that, I'm very blessed with a real natural delivery on the instrument. And, for that reason, I think that's why a lot of times principal players, we're great coaches and maybe not always the best teachers.
Well, that's a good.
I do think because of Chickwitz, I do know how to teach, and I can teach, but I think sometimes the most effective teachers are people who have to struggle a little harder.
I should be a much better teacher. So
you are an excellent teacher.
So, well, that kind of brings me to, that's a great answer about the routine, because, I think, and especially the way you lay it out, the way you lay your week out, because you know what it's like and what you have to do.
And sadly, when I moved to Houston, we do Sunday matinees. And I used to in Atlanta, we didn't do Sunday matinees. We only occasionally worked on Sundays. And I would do a thing where I'd take Sundays off. And I learned that from Tom Ross years ago. And he probably doesn't do that anymore, but at least he used to. He'd always take Sundays off. It was family day. And that would be a day to completely take the horn off. And then the thing that's amazing about that is on Monday, you want to play the trumpet again because you've just can't wait to play.
Yeah.
Well, if you don't ever have a day completely off like that, there's a discipline and a routine there, and that's fine. But here, Sundays are always a work day for me. But to make that special, it's always Sunday, pretty much always Sunday matinees now. Most of our Sunday pops are no longer in the evening, they're in the afternoon. And when we do those matinees, I show up to work and I warm up just a little because we just played a show Saturday night, right? I don't need to warm up much. I'm still warm from the night before. I play a little bit, buzz and play the show, immediately put it away, and I go home and I spend the time the evening with the family.
Yeah.
Or now with my wife, and Sunday night, and then Monday is still something that I look forward to.
Yeah.
And I really do. You know, I've had to adjust that, but Sunday is by far my lightest day. And if you ask Tony, and you know, if he were still, he's probably not still on the line, but if he were, he would tell you, son, you could count on Sundays as being my best day. Sundays were like, I was golden on Sundays. You know, even to this day, I'm still I'm golden on Sundays. And no one knows that. Always when I go to opening nights are always my worst night because it's a 2-session day. So I'm a little fatigued, but you know, Sunday afternoons, I'm almost always golden because, you know, I don't care anymore. I'm just having fun. I'm just literally just having fun. I warm up a little bit and I got plenty of gas and I'm just going out on a Sunday afternoon drive.
Yeah. Yeah. And Tony said he's still here listening. He agrees.
He's probably heard enough of me.
No. So that's segueing into what I was going to say is segueing into the teaching, you know, I was curious about this. What are some things you find yourself focusing on with students that maybe weren't issues for you as a player or when you were studying, that, you know, things that you have to address that maybe you didn't have to deal with?
You know, I will tell you, that's such an amazing question, Mark, because I think all of us, you know, from say, you know, I think Bruce and our generation and your generation being a little younger and Tony being a little younger, we all were very lucky that we came up in a time where I think music education was structured differently than it is today.
Yes.
And I'm going to be very careful how I say this because I don't want to offend anybody that's currently a music educator, but the ones that I'm exposed to at U of H, which the director of athletic bands now is an old student of mine that got his DMA with me. And we talk still a lot. He's a good friend. And we deal with TMEA here in Texas, which is quite the monolith, right? It's hard to change people. They think that they know all of the answers a lot of times. And unfortunately, they do a lot of great stuff, but they're two huge holes. And one of the main building blocks to me of players, any player, is the ability to sight read and to be able to actually read. And this is something I think is essential that has to occur during the dialectic period of your brain growth. And, you know, we're talking middle school. And you can only sight read if the building blocks have been instilled in those players, rhythmic building blocks. And I was trained that way. I'm sure you were trained that way. I'm sure Tony Prisk was trained that way because you guys can all sight read. And I see players, I mean, you can tell I'm getting heated here and I don't want to, but it makes me mad that I have a lot of good players who can't read themselves out of a paper bag. Well, what kind of musician do you think is there? What kind of money are they going to make if they can't sight read?
Yeah.
I mean, and so to me, I mean, you can tell I'm sorry, I'm getting a little too passionate about it, but it really angers me that you've got people who are out, music educators, who are ignoring an essential building block. And that one bothers me the most because here I am, somebody comes in, and to really be studying with Mark Hughes effectively, we should be talking repertoire, you know, fixing some things in the playing, yes. But we should be talking repertoire and colors of sound and all of those things. And I'm sitting here trying to teach someone how to count. And, you know, it's not effective when someone's 20 years old trying to learn to count. That works really good, like I said, in the dialectic period of brain development. But when you're 20 years old, it's really hard to teach that and for it to have the same process in the mental,
Yeah.
thought process. So that's one huge one for me. And that one bothers me a lot. The other thing that I have to teach a lot now, and I guess it doesn't surprise me so much, but it is more so, I think, now than ever before, is teaching good articulation. And I'm thinking about it, in the aspect of what you talked about earlier, and how that, Chickwitz, we didn't talk about articulation. I don't think he talked about articulation other than the illusion of staccato, those kind of things. But he didn't have to talk about where you put your tongue in your mouth.
Right.
And usually it's something that effectively can be done just orally. You hear it, you try to copy it, that kind of thing. And I think today I have to do more of that to get people, to articulate in the right place. And I don't know if that's an music education issue really or not. I don't think so. I think that's more of an oral teaching kind of thing, and the private teaching is maybe not as well rooted as maybe it should be. But those are the two things that, for me, and what I notice. And this year I was tasked with selecting the All-State etudes for Texas for the TMEA. And it worked out great because we were already out for COVID. So I had plenty of time to play through a bunch of etude books and try to pick out particular ones. And if you look at the three, I've got them on my YouTube channel that I posted them. And if you look at the three etudes, you can kind of see what I think the problems are in Texas, at least. With the three etudes that I picked out. It's, where you are right now, Mark, GMEA has probably changed a lot. But when I was actually coming up through the school system there, when you were in seventh, eighth, and ninth grade in junior high, to audition for All-State, you had to learn 5 chromatically adjacent 2-octave scales. So like F sharp, G, A flat, A, and B flat, 2 octaves with arpeggio.
Right.
A chromatic scale from low F sharp to high C and back down. And sight reading. And then you learned a solo in the last round with sight reading.
Yeah.
But to get through the first round, you actually had to play. It was required to play from low F sharp to high C. You could maybe pass if you could only get up to a B flat or something like that. But it was really encouraged to play up to a high C.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden that got watered down to like G. And here in Texas, they don't even ask scales anymore. No scales are required for All-State, just the heck with it.
Really?
So I end up teaching all of my kids at U of H now, they learn scales. That's freshman year, you're learning all your major scales. Now, a lot of the smart kids, they can learn that pretty quickly. But what they don't understand is that's how you build range.
Yeah.
And so all my kids come in and they're good up to G's on top of the staff, and then the tone changes and they thin out, and that's all the range they've got.
Yeah.
And so what I find is, as I teach them 2-octave scales, and they're able to play up to B flat or B natural and C, and then we keep going, C sharp and D and E flat. And they start being able to get up in that kind of range, that they become a whole new kind of player. And the only way, I don't know a secret to high notes. I don't. I have a good high range, but I earned mine like everybody else did. And you do it by practicing it every day. Yeah. And playing scales and stretching your range out. And it takes time. It just takes time and desire. So those are my pet peeves that I get from how times have changed. I don't know what GMEA is doing now, but my guess is it's easier than that to get into Allstate.
Yeah, they don't have the etudes that they make the students play though are not real etudes. They're
Oh,
composed.
they write them?
They write them, and probably I'm guessing the person that writes them doesn't understand the trumpet,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
sometimes those etudes do more harm than good, in my opinion. This year's
yeah,
it's
yeah.
one of the years, but yeah, it's not always idiomatic, you know. But and going back to your
Well, that's right. That's worrying. That's worrying too much that someone might have a few extra days or weeks to prepare an etude.
yeah,
That's the only reason. Why else would you have someone write an etude so that, I mean, come on. I mean, at least in Texas, we use four different books that you can choose from. You can either use the Arbin Characteristic Studies, or you can use the Brandt book, which I'm not going to do. And then, or you can use the Verm, which is very popular.
yeah, for good reason.
Verm is great, and I learned that after coming here. I did not know that book. And but last year, and I think the last 2 years they had used Verm, and so I thought, well, you know what, I would use the other book, which was the Selected Studies of Oxman,
Right.
and I used that book, and that's because there's some Bain and a few other nice little etudes in that collection, and we use those. But we use that rotates, and you can't use them where a kid has where you've used it in the last like 4 or 5 years. So you're not going to have a kid that repeats the same etude, but that's a easy solution to do. And then you can use a real, known good repertoire
Yeah,
etudes.
yeah.
Rarely, I mean, come on,
They're still, I will
you
say,
know, I'll,
they're very good with the scales here, though. I mean, the young kids, the scales are okay. I can't believe that in
well,
Texas.
that's great.
Yeah,
That's great.
yeah,
And the Texas people would come on and right now and argue with me and say, well, we do that at the region level. Well, do they? Not for all state, maybe for something to do with certain region meetings or something like that. But how come my kids, when they come in, they don't know all their scales?
yeah, yeah. It's
I mean,
yeah,
I mean
it's
that's
it's like trying to read without knowing the alphabet. I don't quite understand that when that happens, but
well, yeah. I mean, all those finger patterns should be ingrained, in your fingers, and oh well.
yeah.
I'm starting to sound like an angry old man.
Well, and I
So,
think the advantage us, I dare say, older generations have is that we didn't grow up with the internet, so
yeah.
we listen to music more in a different way than it's consumed right now. In a more way that sticks. I mean, you talked about listening to Marisa.
Does it bother you at all, though, when students come in and they haven't used a metronome and there's one in their pocket?
Yeah.
And
they,
they haven't used a tuner and there's one in their pocket?
but they know there's a camera in their pocket and they know how to use that.
Absolutely.
And
They get all that.
and we're probably very fortunate that we didn't have cameras in our pockets when we grew up either.
That's true. That is true. But I would have killed to have had that portable of a recording device and a tuner and a metronome all so easily in my pocket. I still have my old Franz black electric box that used to somehow fit in my quad case and weigh a ton. That I just for a metronome. I still have that metronome. It's still so loud it hurts your ears, but
Oh,
um,
yeah.
and then my tuner, I do remember when it finally got down to the size of a cassette box that we thought Korg had getting a chromatic tuner, life was awesome. So,
Simpler times.
yeah, no kidding.
Yeah. Well, Mark, I know that people have loved having you on here and so many great answers with all the background with everything and going through your routine and so thank you for doing this. If there's anything else you want to say, because why not?
No, I mean, they've probably gotten tired of hearing my diatribe. Me, as my mom used to, it still says, they're going to bury me with my mouth open so that everyone will say, "Ah, he looks so natural." Um, I'm never short of words, just short on substance. But I've enjoyed doing this because we've owed each other a nice long conversation for a few months now. We haven't really had a good long chat since you moved to Atlanta,
Not really.
and it's been a while, and COVID has brought a lot of interesting things on us, and I hate it for the people who are suffering, and I hate it especially for the gig job sort of economy, um, because that is so essential. I mean, even to orchestral musicians from time to time, it's good for us because that's a way that we socialize more with other than just a few people that's in our orchestra.
Yeah.
And I think we all need that because the smaller that pool is, we all get it now because of quarantining. You know,
Yeah.
this is not an easy thing, but the one good thing about this is I think we're starting to understand technology more and use it to our benefit. And when you wrote me about doing this, that's why I like, yeah, why not? Let's do that. I've done a few of these kind of things, and I'm able to actually touch more younger people, with some truths. High school age kids where I rarely get to do that just because of my schedule and because I have more time. And I'm sure Bruce and Tony and anybody else that's on here, Don, any of us, it's afforded us a little bit more access to everybody.
Yeah.
And so we're lucky in that. And maybe that won't go away, but it's just really nice. And it's nice to be able to chat with you and also see you.
Likewise. And I think COVID's brought on so much more music with the amount of etudes that we've heard people play. It's amazing how much good, good trumpet music there is that Jim Wilt and those guys have
And good players. I mean, there's
played.
a lot of things. Us orchestra grunts in particular, we're always working so much, and we get in our little area, and we don't even get to cross pollinate like we should.
Yeah.
I mean, literally, we don't. And that's the sad thing. Of the few times we get together, and this has afforded us a time to sort of do that. Maybe we're desperate just so that we can communicate,
Yeah.
but there's some good that we've been able to bring out of this. Um, I just hope we don't have to play with masks on the rest of our lives and stuff like that, right? We
Nah,
want to get beyond back to normal. So everybody, please take your vaccines. Um, and I did the test. I'm here to tell you the last thing I will say is I was in the Pfizer study back in September, and I did get the real vaccine. I was just talking with my research group today, and they can't officially tell me that, but I did test positive for antibodies after I took it, so I know I did take it. And you're sore, you're going to have a sore arm. You might feel a little crabby the day after. You might have a low grade fever or just feel run down a little bit. That's normal. That's your immune system coming alive. But if we don't take these vaccines, folks, we can't get back to work. And that was one of the two main reasons that I participated in the study. And while my hair is awful long and needs to be cut and everything, I don't have a horn growing out of the top of my head. Everything is fine, and you can take that Pfizer or the Moderna vaccines. They're both mRNA technology. Um, you can read about it. That's not the first time that's been used on humans. That same technology was used in the shingles vaccine a few years ago. And you've been giving mRNA vaccines to your dogs for years. So if it's good enough for your dogs, it will work for us. So
yeah.
just please, let's all take it and get this stuff taken care of as quickly as possible.
I'm glad you said all that, Mark. Thanks so much, and so thanks for doing this, and thanks to Euclid IQ and Dylan Music and Studio 259 Productions for helping sponsor this. And I'll see you all soon. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.